Halo, apa kabar? Sahabat Mongabay dimanapun Anda berada, salam sehat. Nama saya Rizky Rinanto Sigit, saya Program Manager Mongabay Indonesia, dan saya telah bekerja selama 10 tahun atau sejak awal Mongabay Indonesia berdiri. Saya saat ini membawahi 6 orang staf dan lebih dari 50 orang jurnalis berita atau kontributor yang tersebar di berbagai wilayah Indonesia. Dalam kesempatan ini, saya mengucapkan terima kasih yang luar biasa kepada Anda semua, sahabat Mongabay, yang telah setia selama ini untuk membaca, menonton, mendengarkan, dan juga terlibat aktif dalam berbagai ragam program yang telah kami lakukan. Sahabat Mongabay, sebagai sebuah organisasi, Mongabay Indonesia telah berkembang dan juga telah banyak terlibat dalam berbagai macam liputan berita yang terkait dengan lingkungan maupun sumber daya alam yang ada di Indonesia. Keberadaannya semakin hari semakin diakui, terlihat dari banyaknya artikel yang telah kami terbitkan. Saat ini, 10 tahun sejak Mongabay Indonesia berdiri, kami telah menerbitkan lebih dari 16.000 artikel yang telah dikunjungi oleh 159 juta orang dengan lebih daripada 60 juta individu yang berkunjung ke website kami. Demikian juga dari ragam konten yang ada di sosial media, saat ini kami telah memiliki 104.000 ragam konten yang juga diikuti oleh followers lebih daripada ratusan ribu. Terima kasih atas dukungan Anda semua. Ini semakin memperkuat kami bahwa keberadaan Mongabay dan khususnya isu-isu lingkungan yang ada di Indonesia semakin hari semakin menjadi perhatian kita semuanya. Seperti Anda ketahui, masalah lingkungan semakin hari menjadi masalah yang mengemuka. Mengapa? Karena saat ini kita tidak bisa lagi mengabaikan berbagai persoalan yang ada di dunia. Dan juga Indonesia sebagai negara yang memiliki keragaman hayati yang luar biasa, tetapi juga memiliki masalah-masalah yang harus diselesaikan. Saat ini, Mongabay juga memiliki concern yang besar untuk terus meliput dan juga terus berpartisipasi aktif dalam dekade keduanya untuk semakin membumikan berbagai persoalan lingkungan. Untuk itu, kami berharap agar rekan-rekan bersama dengan kami semuanya dapat terus menyuarakan masalah lingkungan ini. Salam selestari dari kami, Mongabay Indonesia.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Saya Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, mengucapkan selamat hari jadi ke-10 Mongabay Indonesia. Mongabay telah berkontribusi dalam menjaga kelestarian lingkungan dan alam Indonesia melalui beragam berita yang aktual dan berimbang. Semoga semakin sukses. Mari kita jaga laut dan pesisir tetap sehat. Terima kasih. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Santi 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 Om.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Saya Abednego Tarigan, Deputi 2 Kepala Staf Kepresidenan, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun ke-10 untuk Mongabay. Semoga Mongabay menjadi platform berita yang memperkuat pemahaman publik dan membuat kebijakan tentang pentingnya pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. Terima kasih.
Saya Sandra Yati Muniaga, anggota Komnas HAM, mewakili keluarga besar Komnas HAM RI, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Terima kasih karena sudah 10 tahun pula bersama Komnas HAM RI dan Gerakan Hak Asasi Manusia di Indonesia mengupayakan pemajuan dan penegakan hak asasi manusia, khususnya bagi kelangsungan hidup masyarakat adat dan kelestarian lingkungan hidup di Indonesia. Dirgahayu Mongabay Indonesia, semoga terus menjadi sumber informasi yang baik, inspirasi, dan memberi terang masyarakat Indonesia.
Halo sahabat Mongabay Indonesia, selamat malam. Berjumpa lagi bersama saya Akita Verselita di Bincang Alam Mongabay Indonesia. Apa kabar nih sahabat Mongabay semua? Semoga sehat-sehat ya. Senang sekali karena di hari ini, di Bincang Alam hari ini, seperti tadi video yang sudah sahabat Mongabay saksikan, kita merayakan hari jadi ke-10 tahun Mongabay Indonesia. Tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Program Manajer Mongabay Indonesia, Bapak Rizky Rinanto Sigit, tentang bagaimana perjalanan Mongabay beroperasi di Indonesia sejak 1 dekade yang lalu. Dan juga terima kasih banyak kepada Bapak Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, Bapak Insinyur Sakti Wahyu Trenggono, dan juga Bapak Abed Nego Tarigan, yang merupakan Deputi 2 Kepala Staf Kepresidenan, dan Ibu Sandrayati Muniaga SH, selaku Komisioner Komnas HAM. Jadi, seperti yang sahabat Mongabay sudah tahu dari judulnya atau video-video yang saya sudah disaksikan sebelumnya, 1 dekade lalu pertama kalinya Mongabay Indonesia beroperasi pada tanggal 1 Mei, tepatnya 1 Mei 2012. Dan sahabat Mongabay tahu bahwa Mongabay ini menjadi media yang konsisten ya dalam dan berkomitmen untuk memberitakan isu-isu lingkungan di Indonesia secara traktual dan berimbang. Sahabat Mongabay, seperti yang saya sudah sampaikan di Bincang Alam minggu lalu, Mongabay Indonesia ini tidak akan ada dan beroperasi tanpa figur narasumber yang akan kita bawa hari ini ke Bincang Alam untuk ngobrol-ngobrol bersama kita semua. Karena beliau inilah merupakan pendiri Mongabay dan Mongabay Indonesia, dan juga Mongabay Indonesia di hari ini bukan hanya merayakan 10 tahun hari jadi, tapi kita juga ingin merayakan atau memperingati Hari Keanekaragaman Hayati yang jatuh pada tanggal 22 Mei. Nah, sahabat Mongabay, seperti biasa, boleh ya, sebelum kita mulai Bincang Alam hari ini, coba dong, absen dulu dari mana sahabat Mongabay semua berasal. Silahkan juga sharing bagaimana sih sahabat Mongabay ini memperingati Hari Keanekaragaman Hayati sedunia, dan jika ingin menuliskan harapan-harapan untuk Mongabay Indonesia, dipersilahkan ya. Karena Mongabay Indonesia hari ini di Bincang Alam bukan hanya live dan bisa diikuti di YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, maupun Instagram. Tapi sahabat Mongabay juga bisa loh untuk nonton di TikTok-nya Mongabay Indonesia. Silahkan ya yang ingin bergabung melalui TikTok dan menulis komen juga boleh, nanti kita akan coba bacakan kalau misalnya ada waktunya ya. Nah, sahabat Mongabay, mungkin sahabat Mongabay tahu ya bahwa selain Bincang Alam, Mongabay ini juga memproduksi atau mempublikasi artikel-artikel di website dan juga konten di sosial media. Nah, seperti apa sih 10 tahun terakhir ini perjalanan atau perkembangan Mongabay Indonesia? Yuk kita saksikan sama-sama video bagaimana perjalanan Mongabay Indonesia selama 10 tahun terakhir. Silahkan disimak.
10 tahun perjalanan Mongabay Indonesia. Pada April 2012, soft launching Mongabay Indonesia dimulai dengan publikasi artikel pertama di website mongabay.co.id sekaligus posting pertama di Twitter dan Facebook Mongabay Indonesia. Mei 2012, Mongabay Indonesia resmi diluncurkan sebagai bagian dari mongabay.com yang berbahasa Indonesia. Oktober 2013, website Mongabay Indonesia telah mencapai total 1 juta page views sejak pertama kali diluncurkan. Oktober 2015, page views per bulan telah menembus lebih dari 1 juta page views. Maret 2016, follower di Twitter menembus lebih dari 100.000 orang. Juni 2016, follower di Facebook menembus lebih dari 100.000 orang. Februari 2019, akun YouTube Mongabay Indonesia diluncurkan. Juli 2019, total page views mongabay.co.id menembus 100 juta page views sejak diluncurkan, dengan impresi di sosial media mencapai rata-rata 50 juta per bulan. Agustus 2019, akun Instagram Mongabay Indonesia diluncurkan. November 2021, YouTube Mongabay Indonesia menembus total 30 juta video views sejak diluncurkan. Februari 2022, akun TikTok Mongabay Indonesia diluncurkan. April 2022, total video views di TikTok Mongabay Indonesia telah menembus angka 5 juta views. Bersama kita melestarikan Indonesia.
Selamat ulang tahun Mongabay Indonesia. Tidak terasa 10 tahun sudah media ini hadir bersama-sama publik menyoroti isu-isu penting di bidang lingkungan. Kami di Tempo belajar banyak dari kehadiran Mongabay dan dari kolaborasi-kolaborasi liputan yang kita lakukan bersama sejak awal ketika kita bersama-sama menginvestigasi bagaimana perkebunan kelapa sawit di Papua mengancam keberlangsungan hutan tropis di sana, sampai yang terakhir kita liputan bersama mengenai kerusakan laut dan pencurian ikan bersama-sama dengan Environmental Reporting Collective. Dalam perjalanan 10 tahun ini, kami sangat mengapresiasi kontribusi dan peran Mongabay, dan kita sama-sama tahu bahwa krisis iklim yang kita hadapi saat ini adalah isu jurnalistik terbesar yang kita harus liput bersama. Ke depan, kami berharap bisa terus bekerja bersama Mongabay, bersama-sama membangun kesadaran publik dan menggerakkan partisipasi publik dalam sebuah gerakan penyelamatan lingkungan dan penyelamatan bumi kita. Selamat ulang tahun Mongabay, terus berkibar untuk bumi kita. Terima kasih.
Halo, gua Kakak mau mengucapkan selamat atas 10 tahun Mongabay Indonesia. Terima kasih sudah memberitakan kabar penting tentang masalah lingkungan di Indonesia. Makin menginspirasi dan selalu semangat untuk terus bersuara demi kepentingan alam dan masyarakat. Thank you Mongabay Indonesia. Sekali lagi, panjang umur, maju terus.
Sebagai salah satu pemilik kawasan hutan tropis terluas di dunia, Indonesia memiliki peran penting dalam upaya pencegahan perubahan iklim. Kepekaan dan kesadaran publik terhadap pentingnya hutan perlu terus dibangun untuk menjaga kelestarian alam. Sejak berdiri 10 tahun silam, Mongabay Indonesia telah secara konsisten mengangkat berbagai isu perlindungan dan pelestarian lingkungan untuk masa depan yang lebih baik. Saya, Meta Dharma Saputra, CEO dan co-founder Kata Data Indonesia, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga terus menjadi referensi terpercaya dan terdepan dalam isu konservasi dan sains lingkungan di Indonesia.
Gue baru sebelumnya mau ngucapin happy anniversary ke-10 Mongabay. Jadilah satu tempat gue bisa terus belajar. Jadilah satu tempat yang mengangkat kebenaran, ketidakadilan, belalah alam, manusia. Stay cool, karena sedikit yang masih bisa berdiri kayak kalian.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Suryani Mapong dari Lembaga Kantor Berita Nasional Antara dan salah seorang penerima fellowship Mongabay Indonesia mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Tetap jaya dan menjadi garda terdepan untuk mengawal isu-isu lingkungan di Indonesia. Jaya selalu.
Hai, saya Fadli dari Pendiri mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Saya juga salah satu pembacanya dan mendapat banyak inspirasi dari semua yang ada di Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga Mongabay Indonesia terus menyemangati dan terus memberi inspirasi untuk orang-orang yang concern kepada alam dan menjaga alam itu adalah satu yang wajib. Sukses selalu untuk Mongabay Indonesia.
Hai, saya Christopel Paino. Saya adalah jurnalis Mongabay di Gorontalo. Selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 buat Mongabay Indonesia. Jaya terus Mongabay Indonesia, selalu menjadi inspirasi dalam mengabarkan kisah-kisah perjuangan lingkungan di Indonesia demi masa depan lingkungan kita, masa depan ekologi kita. Jaya terus Mongabay Indonesia.
Wah, sudah disaksikan ya sahabat Mongabay ya. Tadi banyak sekali ucapan dari rekan-rekan dan mitra dari Mongabay Indonesia. Luar biasa. Apakah ada yang sahabat Mongabay kenal? Pastinya kalau sudah sering nonton Bincang Alam, sudah tahu tuh kira-kira siapa ya influencer atau artis atau tokoh-tokoh lingkungan lainnya yang sudah pernah diundang di Bincang Alam tuh. Silahkan coba ditulis kira-kira siapa sih dari deretan tadi, figur-figur tadi yang sudah pernah diundang di Bincang Alam. Silahkan di komen ya. Dan tadi juga sebelumnya kita sudah sudah saksikan juga video-video perjalanan bagaimana Mongabay Indonesia sendiri. Pastinya itu semua tidak akan terjadi tanpa dukungan dari sahabat Mongabay semua, terutama sahabat-sahabat Mongabay yang suka nonton Bincang Alam nih. Tepuk tangan untuk kita semua ya. Nah, sahabat Mongabay, seperti tadi yang sudah kita simak ya, sudah panjang banyaknya ucapan-ucapan yang masuk untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak. Nah, sekarang nih yang jadi highlight di Bincang Alam kali ini, pasti sudah nggak sabar ya untuk menyimak bagaimana sih diskusi kita dengan narasumber kita kali ini. Yuk, saya kenalin dulu ya ke narasumber kita hari ini. Nah, ini dia foto dan gambar dari narasumber kita. Sosok yang sangat berpengaruh atau paling berpengaruh ya mungkin dari berdirinya Mongabay dan Mongabay Indonesia. Beliau adalah Rhett A. Butler atau yang disebut dengan atau saya panggil sebagai Rhett Butler. Rhett Butler dilahirkan di California, Amerika Serikat, dan beliau ini merupakan seorang jurnalis, penulis, dan pegiat lingkungan. Pada tahun 1999, Rhett Butler ini mendirikan Mongabay, yang merupakan sebuah platform berita khusus tentang isu-isu konservasi dan lingkungan. Rhett sendiri mendirikan Mongabay karena sejak kecil beliau ini memiliki ketertarikan pada alam dan satwa liar. Nanti kita akan tanya ya, bagaimana sih ketertarikannya Rhett Butler ini gitu. Nah, saat ini Rhett Butler menjabat sebagai CEO Mongabay yang kita tahu sebagai organisasi media non-profit yang didirikan olehnya dan kini telah berkembang menjadi 73 staf di 5 kantor biro. Salah satunya Biro Indonesia dan sudah lebih dari 800 koresponden yang tersebar dari lebih dari 70 negara di dunia ya. Besar sekali ya sahabat Mongabay. Nah, Rhett Butler ini atas kontribusinya dalam bidang lingkungan dan jurnalisme, beliau telah menerima beberapa penghargaan konservasi lingkungan dan jurnalisme, seperti Parker Gentry Award dari Field Museum of Natural History di tahun 2014, penghargaan Pongo Environmental Award di tahun 2020, Wall of Heroes Award dari The Society of Environmental Journalists di tahun 2020 dan penghargaan jurnalisme lingkungan SEAL di tahun 2021. Wah, keren banget ya Mas Rhett Butler ini. Atau saya akan panggil Rhett aja setelah ini. Nah, sahabat Mongabay, kita akan mengundang Rhett Butler dan kita akan mengadakan diskusinya dalam bahasa Inggris ya. Nanti jika sahabat Mongabay kurang paham bisa baca stiker teks yang akan ditampilkan di bawah. Oke, mari kita undang Rhett Butler. Hi Rhett, how are you?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, welcome to Bincang Alam. It's really good to finally have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhett. Rhett, so would you mind to share with us, like, where are you now and probably what time is it there?
Yeah, so I'm at home in California, near San Francisco, and it is about 6:30 a.m.
6:30. That's Very cool ya. So sahabat Mongabay, sekarang nih di tempat tinggalnya Rhett nih masih pagi banget, jam 6.30. Dia sudah bergabung ya sama kita semua di Bincang Alam. Jadi tanpa berlama-lama saya ingin tanya-tanya sedikit sama Rhett Butler. So Rhett, probably I should start asking you some questions. Not only me, but later there will be some questions coming from our friends of Mongabay Indonesia. Is it okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's great. So Rhett, would you mind to share with us how you discover your passion for nature? Like, is it that your passion for nature and conservation has been there with you since you were young?
Yeah, so it was really born very early in my life. My parents gave me opportunities to go to the nearby forests and look for animals, and I just got very interested in the little things. So like reptiles and amphibians and animals like that, but also the whole ecosystem. And then I had the great fortune of having a mother who was a travel agent. And so we were able to travel as children. And because I liked reptiles and amphibians, I was always very interested in tropical forests. And so I always wanted to go to the rainforest. And I had a few opportunities to go, and it was really a magical experience for me. And then sort of from there, my interest in nature kind of transformed into becoming an environmentalist and really trying to understand, well, what's happening with nature. And eventually it led to Mongabay. So I can tell that story a little bit later, but it did really begin in my childhood.
Amazing. So if you may or be able to recall, like which forest that you visited for the first time, if you may recall.
We have forests here in California that are very close by. So within 10 minutes of my house, there are redwood forests. And so redwood forests are a lot like tropical forests, like the rainforest in Indonesia. The trees are very tall. So the trees here can actually get up to 100 meters. These forests are very beautiful. So I guess I won't count that forest, but in terms of the first tropical forest I visited was probably in the Amazon, so in Ecuador. And that was actually the moment that I went from being just someone who appreciated nature to someone who was trying to understand what was happening to the environment. Because when I visited this forest, we stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community. And, I had a wonderful time in that forest. And then we came back to the United States. And a few months later, there was a story in the newspaper about a large oil spill that had happened on that river. And so that area that I just visited was now coated in oil. And so all I can think about is what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals. And so that really led me to become more aware of what was happening to the environment around the world.
I see. That's such a tragic stories there where you start Mongabay. But before we jump into that, like you mentioned that you love amphibians and reptiles. Is it one of the reasons why you choose this gecko as the logo of Mongabay?
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, that sort of ties back to my inspiration for originally getting interested in nature, is I love specifically frogs and lizards. Not sure why, but I just always have. And so originally the Mongabay logo was a picture of a gecko from Madagascar. And then my wife just redrew it so it was a little bit more interesting. So that's where the logo came from.
Amazing. Now, before we start on how you start Mongabay, would you mind to share us what did you do before Mongabay? What was your life like before you start Mongabay? Probably.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's very intertwined. So I think it's probably important for me to go back. So the thing that led me to actually start Mongabay was an experience in the rainforest, actually in Borneo. So not in Kalimantan, but in Sabah, which is the Malaysian side of Borneo. And so I had this experience when I was in high school, where I went to this very beautiful forest, and there were orangutan and like all sorts of hornbills, wonderful wildlife. I came back from that forest and I kept in correspondence with the scientist, and then I later learned that the forest was pulped to make paper, and now it's an oil palm plantation. And so once that happened, I decided I wanted to raise awareness about tropical forests. So, why they're important and, why we should care. And so that was actually in college, so at university. So basically my entire adult life, I've been involved with Mongabay. So there wasn't sort of like a before and after Mongabay, but so what happened was I wrote this book while I was at the university, and then I graduated. But I had no ambition to run a website. I mean, that was no way to make a living, right? So I got a real job, and my university degree is in business and math and economics, so it's very different from what Mongabay is. And so I was planning to go on that path. And so after I graduated from university, I finished this book, but then I started with a real job in Silicon Valley. And so I was, on a computer all day long, which is what I do now anyway, but, working on building like technology products. But I was working on Mongabay nights and weekends because that was really my passion. And so I decided this is a long time ago. So in mid 2003, the site was popular, and I decided to put advertising on the website. And because it was popular, it started to generate revenue. And so I thought, well, maybe I could quit my job and pursue my passion. And so that's what I did. And so once I started doing Mongabay full time, I started building the site a lot more. And so I, created the news section. I created content for children. I started taking photos all over the world. And so that's kind of the real birth of Mongabay, once I started focusing all my attention on it.
Amazing. That's quite, like very distinct differences of how you start as a tech person or tech guy in Silicon Valley, and then you start with Mongabay and start as a blog post. So would you mind to share with us, probably some of our friends here doesn't know how Mongabay start. What is Mongabay? Like, why is the name so strange, especially for the ears of Indonesians? Would you mind to share with us, like, why do you choose the name of Mongabay? Like, is there any specific explanation for that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a funny name. So when I wrote this book, I was planning to publish the book, but then the publisher was an academic press, and so it didn't have a lot of resources, and so I was planning to publish like a textbook with just pictures. With no pictures. And so to me, that defeated the purpose of trying to convey the beauty of rainforests and why they're important. And so I thought, well, I didn't write this book for money. I wrote it, to raise awareness. And so I decided to put the book on the internet so people could read it for free. And I needed a name for the website. And there was this beautiful island off Madagascar that was kind of my idea of paradise. So it was this tropical island that was covered with rainforests, surrounded by coral reefs, had all sorts of really interesting frogs and lizards, but also lemurs and other interesting creatures. And so I thought, well, this is a beautiful place. I'm going to derive the name. I'm going to derive a name from this. And so I changed the name so it was easier for gringos to pronounce. So to Mongabay, and it was a unique name. So if you went to a search engine back then, before Google or around the time Google started, and typed in Mongabay, and the only thing that would come up would be the website. And so the idea was that it would be easy to see when people were referencing the website or talking about it. So I could easily track, how the site was doing. And it was a unique name. But the reality was I didn't think I was going to run a website for a living. So I didn't really think the name was, all that critical, but it was nice having a unique name. And so, it's again, harkens back to the origin of the inspiration for Mongabay, which is, really nature and wildlife.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing with us. That would be a brief introduction of how you start Mongabay and how we can understand your passion in nature. You mentioned that you have been traveling to Madagascar, to the Amazon rainforest. Probably we should jump into how do you see Mongabay Indonesia. So before you start Mongabay Indonesia, like, did you ever or have you visited Indonesia first before you decided to start a bureau here in Indonesia, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I had visited Indonesia a few times, and I had a great appreciation for Indonesia. It's one of my favorite countries. It's just such an incredible place with so much diversity of habitats, of wildlife, of people. It's really just an incredible country. And so Mongabay, started out as just me. And for most of the, first 10 years of Mongabay, it was really just me on my laptop in my pajamas in my apartment, writing articles. Eventually I had, another staffer, but it was just like two of us. And so it was very small, but I had ideas for Mongabay to really have more impact in the world. And one of the places I saw as the best opportunity for impact was Indonesia. So again, Indonesia is this place that has incredible biodiversity, but there's also a very high degree of threat. And a lot of that threat is around how natural resources are managed. And I thought that journalism is actually something that could help make a difference, because one of the problems is natural resource sector, like how resources are managed. And so there's more transparency, there could be more accountability. And so it could help tip Indonesia towards a pathway where there's more protection of the environment and recognition of indigenous rights and things like that. So I saw Indonesia as being this really interesting place to expand where there could be impact. But there was no sort of business model based off advertising, to have an Indonesian language bureau. And so I decided to change Mongobay's entire model. And so I launched a nonprofit specifically to start Indonesian bureau. Now I don't speak Indonesian, so I'm just like, some middle-aged, white guy in America. So like, I'm not really positioned to run an Indonesian bureau. And so, my contribution here was really to try to find the resources to then hire people who were experts in this and can actually, make this a success. And so thankfully I was able to get a grant from a foundation. And so as soon as I got that grant, I announced that we were going to try to do this, even though I was completely unqualified to do it. And, I put out these job descriptions in English and Indonesian, and there was a lot of interest because people were reading Mongabay in English in Indonesia. And so I had a whole bunch of really amazing candidates apply for these positions. I went over to Jakarta and interviewed, I think it was like 40 people in 3 days, and hired the initial team. And I think, Ridsky was the first hire. And I think he officially joined the team within a month. And I think we launched the site a month after. And then within a month after that, Mongabay Indonesia, I think, was the most popular Indonesian language environmental news service, dedicated environmental news service in Indonesian. And so it was just amazing how this team, took this, idea and ran with it and created this amazing resource. And then Mongabay Indonesia became the inspiration for Mongabay's expansion into other places. And so, Mongabay English learned a lot from Indonesia. So, we learned about social media, like how to do social media better, how to build a network of journalists. So Mongabay Indonesia has had this sort of fundamental role in the overall success of Mongabay.
Okay, thank you so much. That quite comprehensive explanation on how you start Mongabay Indonesia. As you mentioned that we have grown so big in a very short span, which is only 10 years. But before we jump into that, probably would you mind to share that how you experience traveling to Indonesia back then? Now probably last week we celebrate World's Biodiversity Day. So how do you see the biodiversities in Indonesia? And how do you usually see them or enjoy them or monitor them in Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, so my first trip to Indonesia, I went to South Sumatra, in Kalimantan and Jakarta, and Borobudur. So I mean, it was like it was a small selection of Indonesia, but it was like a nice cross section. So I did see a lot of biodiversity, and so it was like a first taste of what Indonesia had to offer. I've been to Malaysia several times before that, so I had like a general sense of what Kalimantan would be like, but really seeing these different islands gave me that taste. And so I then came back and went to, I've now been to a lot of Indonesia, but Indonesia is definitely one of the most biodiverse countries on earth. So if you look at both land and ocean, it kind of competes with Brazil in terms of biodiversity. And so, it just ranks at the top, and it's just incredible, like how many different ecosystems there are in the country, and the differences between two islands that are, fairly close to each other can have, a totally different makeup of species. And so, it is really incredible. And I think it's underappreciated. And I think there's also a lot of value in that in terms of opportunities for tourism and natural capital and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of ways to sort of use or leverage that biodiversity without destroying it. And I think that's really important, because this is Indonesia's heritage. It's what makes Indonesia special and unique. So like, almost any tropical country can grow, can produce palm oil, but Indonesia has these ecosystems everywhere else. And so that's like its, competitive advantage, so to speak.
Okay, that's would that what that you the things that you mentioned just now could be one of the challenges of how Mongabay Indonesia been operating in Indonesia, right? So probably you can share with us, other than Mongabay Indonesia, is there any other countries that probably have the similar challenges as what Indonesia, especially regarding to the biodiversity and the management of the resources, for example? Let's say, would you mind to share with us how the other countries of Bureau would be handling this kind of situations, and what are the issues of concern? Probably similar to Indonesia or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's parallels in all. I mean, all countries are unique, but there's definitely parallels. And so, if you look at countries that are similar to Indonesia, that are like large tropical countries, a lot of the issues are similar. So you might have issues around governance or management of natural resources. Sometimes there's corruption. So you look at like Brazil, it's very similar. Madagascar has similar issues. You also have issues of poverty, and so it sets up a dynamic where a lot of people are just trying to produce food to feed their families. And typically, that's kind of a traditional approach. It doesn't result in like large scale destruction. Where you really get the large scale destruction typically is when you have companies that are coming in and getting large concessions and then taking that land and converting it for, say, like in the Amazon, it would be cattle pasture. In other places, it's like plantation agriculture. And so those concessions then dispossess traditional users of that land and of those resources. So it's a source of conflict. And so Indonesia is not unique that way. That's all over the world. But that said, I mean, there's also issues in places like the United States. So here, the United States is an industrialized, very wealthy country. One of the reasons why the U.S. is wealthy is a lot of the resources were extracted very early. So if you go back, 100, 200 years, a lot of the forests were, logged, to produce energy or, build buildings, things like that. But, since in the past 200 years, there's been this huge resurgence in the amount of forest cover in the United States. So now we have forests in the United States, more forests now than we had 100 years ago. So it's like, there's sort of like a typical development cycle that sort of plays out. It doesn't have to play out that way, but that's just typically how it has. And so a place like the United States still has a lot of environmental issues. We still have problems with old growth forest law. So, there's still forests that are very biodiverse in the southern parts of the United States that are being converted for plantations. And so it is a big problem. So it's not like it's just these problems are only in Indonesia or only in Africa or the Amazon. They're really all over the world. And if you look at a place like Europe is, in some ways, is almost like a garden because a lot of the forests were converted, a long, long time ago. And now the forests are very carefully managed, and they're more like, almost like plantations in many countries. And so like true natural old growth forest is pretty rare in parts of Europe. But that said, Europe has a lot of tree cover and things that look like forests if you aren't a forest ecologist.
Okay, thank you, Rhett. So as I can conclude that actually Indonesia is a good reflection of how it's a global challenge. Anything related to the environmental conservation and resources management is reflected in Indonesia. So thank you for that. Earlier when we start this Bincang Alam, there was a greeting by Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. Currently, in G20, is one of the biggest international forum. They have been talking about blue carbon and how the government's hands in hand managing the resources in the oceans. How do you see that, Rhett? How do you see Indonesia as an archipelagic country with a lot of island, more than 17,000 islands and huge marine resources. How do you see that other than, land biodiversities?
Oh, I mean, the ocean is, very important for all these issues. I mean, from climate change to biodiversity loss. So yeah, I mean, the ocean is very much part of it. The science is getting better and better in terms of understanding how oceans store carbon, but also sort of the land ocean interface. So like, seagrass, mangroves, and their importance in, helping slow climate change, but also the other ecosystem services that are provided. So like, protection against storm damage or even, tsunami. The fact it's a nursery for fisheries. So, destroying mangroves has a big impact on, the availability of protein for local people. So, oceans are absolutely critical, and Indonesia is arguably the most biodiverse country when it comes to oceans, just by virtue of of its extent and everything else, the Coral Triangle. So, I think it's absolutely critical to consider oceans when we're talking about biodiversity and climate.
Yes, thank you, Rhett. So, other than those anthropogenic or man-made disasters in the oceans and the land, have you ever enjoying the beauty of the nature of the underwater world in Indonesia before?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Indonesia has the best underwater environment I've experienced. So I've been very lucky to snorkel and go diving in many places in Indonesia, from Sulawesi to Komodo to Papua, and yeah, I mean it's spectacular. It's really unrivaled.
Amazing. That's really good to hear. Probably some of our friends would like to share their experiences as well. Please don't forget to comment, guys. Rhett, probably next question. How do you see Mongabay Indonesia now as a media, a non-profit media that is focusing on the issue of environmental and conservation, to face or to thrive in these challenges, whether it is on the production of how we write the stories that we are trying to convey, and also on the reporting on the field? Would you think that despite all these challenges, Mongabay Indonesia would be able to, do our best during this, very difficult moments, probably?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mongabay Indonesia, one of its strengths has been its ability to adapt. So, over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of changes. I mean, 10 years is a long time in sort of, the technology world. So people, the way people consume content has changed. And Mongabay Indonesia has really been, at the forefront of Mongobay's efforts to, to try to meet people where they're at. And so to reach new audiences, like, like this platform is important, TikTok, things like that. And I would say that, Mongabay, global Mongabay, English Mongabay learns a lot still from what Indonesia is doing. And so it is very important. Mongabay Indonesia is also dealing with some of these challenges that are occurring all around the world. So, issues around, fake news, where people don't know how to discern what's real or not real. And so how do you convey information on, controversial or difficult topics to an audience that doesn't understand like what aspects make a story credible or not credible? And so this isn't just limited to Indonesia. This is really markets all over the world. There's also problems with, some of these platforms, like Facebook, where, the algorithms are just so bad. They can't recognize like good content from bad content. And, they will block content regularly just because the algorithm is bad, or they don't understand the context. And so, that's again something we're having to navigate in the various markets that we operate in. And then there's another issue, which, honestly affects Indonesia as well, but there's sort of this movement towards clamping down on freedom of expression and the free press. And this is, again, not just Indonesia, it's Singapore, it's Brazil, it's, India, but it's another challenge that we're, trying to navigate. But again, I think that Indonesia is really at the cutting edge of this, and we're learning a lot from what the team in Indonesia is doing.
Okay, thank you, Red. So probably one of the the obstacles probably is the how the media provide transparency and to provide the integrity of the stories that we bring, especially to the audiences. So to that extent, like how would you see Mongabay, especially Mongabay Indonesia, give impact to the environment, especially now that after 10 years of operating in Indonesia, there is also a shift in the demography of our audience. For example, today in Bincang Alam, we engage with a lot of youngsters, or probably those who 10 years was only 30 years old, now they are 40 years old. There is a shift of our audiences and the overall demography of Indonesia. How do you see that? Like, how do you expect Mongabay Indonesia to give impacts on the saving into the environment to the audiences nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, so as a media organization, we're focused on providing information rather than so we provide information to inform people in their decisions. So we tend not to tell people what to think. I mean, that's not our goal. We want to just provide them information and let them make their own decisions. But we do care about impact. So even though we're not like advocating for something, we do care about impact, and so we try to capture that impact, and we have various systems for doing that. And so the nice thing is that we do understand how journalism can drive impact in the real world. And so this is variable, but one of the ways this happens is we may do reporting on a local community that has a solution to managing a forest or like restoring a peatland. And when we report on that, it creates more visibility for that solution. So other communities might adopt that same approach. You might see philanthropists or other funders provide more resources to that community to expand on that work. So we try to understand, when we report on something, like what are those kind of knock-on effects. There are also things like we might report on, corruption around a plantation or something like that. And so by showing the fact that this plantation was, granted illegally or, through some sort of shady process, and that it's impacted both the environment, but also local communities, it creates more pressure for there to be some sort of resolution to the issue. Also, just highlighting the impact of destructive projects. So the project may have some benefits, but there may also be some problems with it that result. And so just shining a light on that. Also, illegal activity. So, for example, if there's poaching going on in a protected area or something like that, Mongabay does a story about it, and then later the Ministry of Environment and Forestry does an investigation or does a raid or something like that, or arrests the traffickers or something like that. And so we do look for examples of impact like that. And we have some really exciting I guess case studies of where a Mongabay story has then resulted or contributed to some very important impact in the world.
Thank you, Rhett. I have one last question from me for you. This is regarding the multiple awards that you have received, such as the Parker Gentry Award, and then other awards that I have mentioned earlier. And you also see that the journalist contributors of Mongabay Indonesia has received some national and international recognition or awards as well. So how would you describe this achievement to the field of journalism, not only just in the matter of the environmental conservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the awards are just a nice testament to the amazing work that our network of journalists and our staff are doing. I mean, sometimes I'll get an award, but I'm just getting the awards in the head of Mongabay. It's not actually for me; it's really for the organization and all the great work that people are doing. And so it's really nice to see associations of journalists and other groups that are pointing to Mongabay and saying, this group of people is doing really excellent work, and so we want to highlight that. And so I think it's a real honor and testament again to the amazing and hard work that everyone associated with Mongabay is doing.
I see. Thank you so much, Rhett, for answering my questions. that probably those questions probably has answered some of the curiosity of Mongabay friends that now watching Bincang Alam. Now, before we proceed to the next list of questions that our audiences has prepared or submitted to you. Let's see one video, more greetings for more friends of Mongabay. Let's check it out.
Saya Ibrahim, Rektor Universitas Bangka Belitung mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 kepada Mongabay Indonesia. Mongabay Indonesia dalam kiprahnya selalu menghadirkan tulisan-tulisan yang tajam dan berkualitas di bidang lingkungan hidup. Sukses selalu dan semoga menjadi pionir dalam upaya advokasi dan mendorong literasi terhadap lingkungan hidup di Indonesia.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Hadi Sukadi Ali Kodra, Guru Besar Ilmu Pelestarian Alam dan Pembinaan Marga Satwa, Fakultas Kehutanan Lingkungan IPB University. Saya pada kesempatan ini ingin mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 bagi Mongabay Indonesia. Teruslah Mongabay Indonesia berkarya bagi kemaslahatan konservasi dan lingkungan hidup, berarti juga bagi kemaslahatan umat manusia, khususnya Indonesia. Saya yakin bahwa Mongabay akan menjadi media lingkungan yang terus berkembang dan menjadi media lingkungan dan konservasi terdepan yang selalu memberitakan alam Indonesia termasuk konservasinya. Salam konservasi, maju Mongabay.
Saya Amir Hamidi, peneliti herpetologi BRIN, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun Mongabay Indonesia yang ke-10. Jadilah media lingkungan yang selalu inspiratif, mencerdaskan masyarakat dengan liputan yang berbasis ilmiah.
Halo, saya Sunarto, peneliti Satwa Liar Indonesia, mengucapkan Dirgahayu Mongabay Indonesia yang ke-10. Jadilah media terdepan dengan liputan yang makin mendalam. Selamat ulang tahun.
Halo, saya Farhan Elmi, saya Kepala Sekolah Tamrin School of Climate Change and Sustainability dan juga Presiden di Lans Indonesia. Saya mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun kepada Mongabay Indonesia atas dedikasinya untuk menyebarluaskan literasi tentang keberlanjutan sumber daya alam, lingkungan, dan perubahan iklim. Tidak banyak media yang memilih jalur seperti ini, dan saya berharap Mongabay Indonesia terus menjaga idealismenya untuk membuka satu perdebatan yang sehat di Republik ini. Sekali lagi, selamat kepada Mongabay Indonesia.
Oke, sahabat Mongabay, tadi barusan sama-sama kita saksikan ya rekan-rekan peneliti dan juga akademisi yang selama ini juga bekerja bersama Mongabay, karena Mongabay pastinya akan mendengar juga bagaimana peneliti ini maupun ahli-ahli konservasi mengutarakan pendapat atau perspektif mereka berdasarkan keilmuan ya, basis keilmuan. Nah, sahabat Mongabay, beberapa minggu yang lalu kami sudah menyebarluaskan sebuah form untuk sahabat Mongabay isi. Jadi form itu memang untuk memberikan pertanyaan-pertanyaan langsung kepada Rhett Butler. Nah, pertanyaan-pertanyaannya sudah kita saring dan jangan sedih karena akan ada merchandise yang kita bagikan untuk sahabat-sahabat Mongabay yang pertanyaannya terpilih ditampilkan di Bincang Alam ini dan juga pastinya akan dijawab oleh Rhett Butler. Jadi simak terus ya sesi Q&A dengan Rhett Butler di sesi kedua ini. Jadi nanti kalau misalnya pertanyaan sahabat Mongabay muncul, kita akan hubungi dan nanti akan dikirimin merchandise-nya. Oke, tanpa berlama-lama, mari kita panggil kembali Rhett. Hi Rhett.
Hi there.
Okay, so are you ready to answer some questions coming from our friends of Mongabay that has been submitted their questions for you?
I'm ready.
Amazing. Okay, let's start from the first question. It is coming from Dimas US from Bandung Institute of Technology. So probably Dimas is a student or probably a lecturer. We don't know, but he is now in Bandung. The question for you is, which sustainable development goal or SDG that Mongabay concentrate on?
I mean, so frankly, Mongabay doesn't really, we don't think too much about the SDGs generally. And we focus on certain topics that, that we cover. And so kind of our main beats would be around nature and the environment. So that would be oceans, forests, wildlife, and then how those things intersect with communities. So, indigenous communities, but also local communities. And then also the conservation sector. So I think, our focus is really cross-cutting than rather trying to put it in the context of SDGs. But I would say we probably are touching on many of them.
Yeah, so probably when we are talking about the environmental itself, there will be some cutting to the economic or social, and also some infrastructure development, for example. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so like something around infrastructure development, we'd be looking at like how do livelihoods and the environment intersect, and so what are the implications of economic development on both productivity in nature, but then also like local communities, and what are like paths forward for green development.
Amazing. Okay, thank you, Rhett. That's the first question from our friends Dimas in Bandung. Let's go to the second question from Rizky Ero. This is interesting. What is the source of Mongo-Based financing or funding, and how can it be sustained? Now that you mentioned earlier on your explanation that you started by yourself and then you established Mongabay Indonesia as a non-profit organization, but how are we sustained so far for 10 years?
Yeah, so we've evolved over time. So Mongabay again started as a for-profit based on that advertising, but now we're a nonprofit. So that means we're primarily getting our resources from grants and donations. So grants are coming from philanthropic foundations, usually in the U.S. and Europe, and donations are coming from around the world. But everything from wealthy people to grassroots support. And so one of the things that's a little bit challenging being a nonprofit media organization is we have to be very careful about conflict of interest or any sort of influence. So we can't take money from someone who's trying to influence our coverage. And so we do have to say no to some funders. Like if a funder says, we want you to cover this. Well, that's a red line for us because we need to be able to independently decide what we're going to cover, as a journalism organization. So it kind of like limits the pool of places we can get resources from. But that said, Mongabay has a very strong track record of delivering on results, and we've got good credibility, and so we've managed to continue to grow every year. Since we started as a nonprofit in 2012. So we have this growth trajectory, and the outlook is pretty good. We've managed to weather financial downturns and the pandemic, and so I'm quite bullish that we'll continue to grow and that our model is a sustainable and viable one.
Okay, thank you, Rhett. So that can be said that the funding or the source of funding would be one of the reflection on how we are become independent and hold on our stance on idealism and integrity as a non-profit media, correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Okay, thank you, Rhett. Now the third question would be also interesting because it is there is a cutting or in line with the thing that you mentioned earlier, which is technology. There is a question from Mahtadi Azhar from Sidoarjo, East Java. The question is, according to Mongabay or to you, would electric cars actually benefit the environment in the long run? This is interesting. Why? Because in G20, the government in Indonesia has been, announcing that they are using the electric vehicles to as a mode of transportation in during the G20 in Bali. So how do you see this kind of technology racing in the livelihood? Is it affecting the environment in the long run, or there is a downfall to that?
Yeah, I mean, so just as a media organization, so Mongabay doesn't have an official position on electric cars. That being said, I personally, I can speak to my own opinion. And so I think electric cars are really important as part of this green transition. That said, there are always downsides, and you have to like look at the full picture. And so, one of the challenges with electric cars is the materials that go into the batteries and other components. So electric cars use a lot of materials that when they're extracted from the earth, they have this environmental impact. So we have to like look at the whole life cycle of production. But in general, if we incorporate that and address those issues in the supply chain, I think electric cars are really important to transition away from fossil fuels. So here in California, electric cars are very common. Like in my neighborhood, I would say probably 25% of cars are electric now. Maybe it's 20%, it's something around there, but they're very common. So we've had this big, I mean, I guess everyone has had this, but we had a big increase in oil prices, in the United States, and people with electric cars are less affected. I personally, my family has like a plug-in hybrid, so it means it can be gas or electric. And we've only gotten gas once in the past 2 years. We've been able to rely on electricity. But the other thing you need to think about is what is the source of that electricity? And so is that electricity coming from clean sources, or is it coming from burning coal? And so again, you have to like think about the whole picture, before you can pass judgment. But I would say that electric cars provide a really good opportunity for transitioning to a much greener approach compared to traditional combustion engines.
All right, so it's the thing that we have to look at it from the upstream to downstream, like how it made and what kind of energy that powers this electric car as well. Okay, thank you, Rhett. That's a question from our friend Mahtadi Azhar from Sidoarjo, East Java. Shall we proceed to the next question?
Sure.
Okay, because there are a lot of questions actually lining up, but let's make it efficient. So the next question is coming from Srikandi Rumpit from Makassar, South Sulawesi. Have you ever visited Makassar before, Red?
I have, yes.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so the question is, has Mongabay ever faced challenge and threats from the people who destroy the environment, such a threat or other unfavorable actions forcing or coming towards Mongabay?
Yeah, we have. So the most common is sort of legal threats, where a company will send a cease and desist letter or make some threats. The thing is that usually it's sort of bluffing, or it's a threat that's kind of empty, because they're claiming some sort of misinformation, but then they don't actually point to the misinformation. They just want us to take an article down. And so, typically it's fairly straightforward to resolve the issue. We have received some other types of threats. I mean, we did have, one of our journalists get arrested and thrown in jail in Indonesia. That was Phil Jacobson in 2020. We had a journalist threatened with prison in Peru. I've had physical threats against me personally. There's attempts to hack us all the time. One of our journalists in Brazil had a death threat, and we had to, help address that issue and be sure that he was safe. So yeah, we are accustomed to dealing with various types of threats. So it is incorporated into our risk management and our strategic planning. So we are, we do address these things and keep all of our journalists safe.
Okay, thank you for answering the question. So, I think Indonesia has ever once faced, when Philip Jacobson, it was quite a big news for us as well. So the similar questions coming from our friend Asyanti Pahlevi in Pontianak, West Kalimantan. So as you mentioned that there is such a hard work for the journalists to work on the field and to face this sort of threats. So to what extent would Mongabay Indonesia will assist and build the capability of the journalists and contributors in terms of the overall safety and expertise?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. So we do provide some information on how to do that, and we have ambition to roll out a program which has more training, both on physical security but also digital security. And so we've implemented the digital security training with staff over the past year, and we are expecting to have some based programs in the future to help journalists stay safe and protect themselves.
I see. Okay, that's amazing. That's awesome. Thank you. Now, some of our journalist contributor that is joining has the answer for that. Okay, let's go to the next question. Coming from Dimas Taufani from Jakarta. Rhett, which nation in the world, in your view, has the most serious and irreparable environmental damage, and why? Probably Indonesia or some other countries?
It's not Indonesia. I guess I'd have to think about it a little bit more. I mean, there's some countries in like Eastern Europe that have very severe and extensive environmental damage that's pretty hard to recover from. But I would say generally, like a lot of countries around the world have places that are very damaged. And so if we're talking about just like the Indonesian context, I would say, parts of Sumatra and Kalimantan where you've had sort of peatlands that have been very degraded. Those ecosystems or those areas are just biological deserts, and the recovery is very difficult. You have like fire regimes and things like that. So those are pretty close to as bad as it gets, I would say. Within mining areas, you can have very severe destruction that's hard to recover from. In parts of the Amazon, some of the soils are so heavily degraded by, degradation and poor pasture management. Recovery is pretty difficult. So I don't want to generalize and say, like an entire country. It's hard to say like an entire country is, is unrecoverable. But there's certain parts of many countries where they're just, it's pretty desolate. I mean, Madagascar would be another example where there's areas where there's been deforestation followed by fire, followed by poor pasture management, followed by fire, and so those areas are just so degraded, it's hard to imagine recovery happening. But that said, I mean, if you give an ecosystem enough time, nature often finds a way. But it may not be on the scale of a human lifetime in terms of when the ecosystem will recover.
I see. Thank you for answering the question. So this is the next question would be a bit of like a follow-up question for your answer. So the question coming from Felinda Halim in Surabaya, and the question is: should we be worried that the global economic recessions would ultimately diminish everyone's care for the environment? Now that you mentioned that in some other countries other than Indonesia, that there are severe destruction of the biodiversity and the environmental. So now that economic recession has arisen, would it be like we are going backwards to where this mission of conservation itself, or how do you see that?
Well, I think it's very complex, and so there's a lot of interest right now in addressing climate change, and conservation and helping protect nature is seen as a way for addressing climate change. So there are more resources kind of going into the sector right now, sort of independent of the economy. That said, I mean, economic downturn has an impact on the environment. So typically governments and companies will, prioritize short-term gains over long-term costs. And so that often has very negative environmental impacts. So I think it's a clouded picture, but I would say if there is a severe recession, in some places there will be less money for conservation, and there will be more emphasis on extracting resources as fast as possible, to generate revenue, rather than thinking about the long-term impacts or long-term costs of those activities.
Yeah.
So it's complex.
Yeah, it's a very complex. Now, okay, let's scaling down how we see things. Because the next question would be also interesting because you mentioned about the long-term impact of the destruction. So the next question is coming from Ahmad Riza. The question is, what do you think of scientists' attempt to bring back extinct species by genetic engineering, cloning, or anything else? Is this attempt possible and worthwhile?
I mean, I think it's definitely possible. I think it's distraction. And I think what it does is it's expensive. So a lot of resources are going into it. It also creates sort of a way for us to not address problems now. So you can say like, well, why bother to save any species if, in 50 years we can just clone them and not worry about it. People don't necessarily think about, well, we need to have habitat for those species to thrive, but so it's sort of like a way out to, kick the problem down the road and not address it now. That said, there are some species where if they were brought back, they could have a disproportionate impact on the environment or addressing climate change. So for example, the mammoth. So, I mean, there is some upside, but the question is, what are the priorities? Like, are we trying to save species before they go extinct and save their habitats before they go extinct? And so I think, there's scarce resources. So we have to decide, okay, what's most important to address now with, the resources we have. So again, I mean, it's kind of it's not a great answer, but I would say there are, generally, I think a lot of it is a distraction.
Okay, so it's like we are we are having some kind of options, like whether we want to conserve what we have now, or we want to, like trying to relieve the extinction and the destructions, and it's gonna be quite difficult, don't you think so?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really need to address these issues that we face now. That being said, I mean, like, de-extinction is only going to get cheaper and easier as time goes on because of technology. So in 20 years, it might be much easier to bring back a mammoth than it is now. But I would say the priority now should be, preserving the habitat and, the modern day equivalent, which are, elephants. How do we protect them and avoid them going extinct?
Okay, thank you, Rhett. Next question is very unique, coming from Muhammad Tamimi from Madura, East Java. Do you consider starting Mongabay Kids in Mongabay, Indonesia? Now that the demography of the audiences are shifting, now the youngsters are interested in the matter of environment and sustainability. Now we have younger audiences. Even one of our friends that commented earlier, she said that she has been following Mongabay since she was in elementary school. So have you ever considered on creating a platform for the children or the kids to start looking into Mongabay Kids?
I mean, that's a good question. So it's actually more of a question for the Indonesian team because Mongabay Indonesia is fairly autonomous. So like that would really be a decision for the Indonesian team to make rather than myself. That being said, we do have some basic resources that were created originally for kids in Indonesian. And we recently launched Mongabay Kids in English. So this is the sort of this new version of Mongabay Kids was launched less than a year ago. So it's pretty new. But, that being said, Mongabay in Indonesia has created a lot of materials around certain subject areas for young audiences. And, but I would leave it up to the Indonesia team to sort of decide what they want to prioritize and the extent to which they may want to build that out further. But I would be very supportive of any decision they decided to make on that, because I do think it is important to reach those young audiences, which is the next generation of decision makers.
Okay, thank you, Rhett. Hopefully, Rizky, as a program manager, see your answer, so he start considering on Mongabay Kids, because even some of our audience in Bincang Alam, they are also very young age, and they have been very participative on Bincang Alam. Okay, second to last question, coming from Taufik Wijaya in Palembang, South Sumatra. So Previously, we have mentioned how technology incorporated with environment and what would be the best, approach for the environmental conservation. But the question is that is there still a lot of local knowledge found in various ethnic groups in the world related to the forest, rivers, and sea? And how do you see the local knowledge would be able to contribute, especially now in Indonesia itself? Like, we have a lot of indigenous communities that helping and also called as local heroes of the environment. How do you see that?
Absolutely. Indigenous knowledge is, fundamental in understanding these ecosystems, how they can be managed, how they can be restored, why they're important. And I think one of the positive things in the world over the past 5 years is recognition of traditional knowledge, indigenous, but also, community knowledge is really growing. And so we see more NGOs, governments, and other entities recognizing the contributions these communities have made towards achieving, biodiversity or climate goals just by their traditional practices. So, like, for example, here in California, there's much more recognition of traditional forest management practices that involve fire. So these controlled burns that indigenous people have been using for thousands of years. So the government here in the United States is finally kind of waking up to the fact that these are really important and successful ways to mitigate fire risk and also help maintain biodiversity and keep forest ecosystems healthy and productive. And so that extends also, to ocean ecosystems and to other countries. And so, certainly in Indonesia, there are many forest communities that have incredible knowledge that is quite valuable and important, for us to recognize and understand.
Okay, thank you, Rhett. Okay, this is the final question for you. You have talked a lot on how you built Mongabay Indonesia and how your perspective. What are your perspective in how Indonesia could conserve the environment and resources, and also how Mongabay Indonesia can contribute in the term of environmental journalism. Now, the final question for you, as this is the celebration of the 10th year of anniversary of Mongabay Indonesia. What would be your wishes or your hope, and how do you see Mongabay Indonesia in the future, probably 10 years from now?
So I would like to see Mongabay Indonesia continue to grow its audience and reach new people. So not only, reaching the people who are environmentalists, but really reaching a broader spectrum of society. And so those new audiences may come from, different platforms, so these emerging new platforms, but also trying to figure out ways to reach these audiences through content that's relevant to them. So it might be through, looking at food systems or energy or, traditional culture, things like that. So really expanding that audience base. Another thing I'd like to see more of is bringing in different data sources to inform the journalism. So whether that's data from satellites or bioacoustic devices or environmental DNA, local knowledge, and having that be a source for journalistic reporting. So those are two of the major threads I would like to see us really expand on and develop. And, both of those things could translate to real world impact on the ground. So I'd like to see the impact of reporting, continue, but also expand and deepen.
Okay, thank you so much, Rhett. That's such a beautiful wish for us, and how we can see or develop Mongabay Indonesia better and better in the future. And that's probably not going to happen without the contribution of our audiences as well. For example, now Bincang Alam, I believe that we have exceeded more than 80 episodes. So now that's also one of the, like a milestone for us, especially for Bincang Alam team as well. Okay, thank you so much, Rhett. that would be the last question that close our discussion for today. I would like to say thank you so much, and also thank you for all our friends from Sahabat Mongabay or Mongabay friends for submitting the questions to you. After this, we are going to see the video of our activist friends or local heroes that sending us some greeting as well. Feel free, you are welcome to watch as well. Oke, ayo sahabat Mongabay, kita simak beberapa video ucapan dari beberapa rekan-rekan aktivis-aktivis penggerak lingkungan. Mari kita simak sama-sama.
Saya Ruka Sombolinggi, Sekjen Aman, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 untuk Mongabay. Semoga tetap menjadi media yang terdepan dalam menyampaikan berita lingkungan dan masyarakat adat serta keadilan iklim. Sekali lagi, sukses buat Mongabay.
Halo, saya Mardi Minangsari, Presiden Perkumpulan Kaum Telapak, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 bagi Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga Mongabay Indonesia selalu konsisten dalam menyajikan liputan yang aktual dan faktual, serta menjadi barometer media lingkungan yang mengedukasi masyarakat, serta menjadi salah satu agen perubahan dalam penyelamatan lingkungan di Indonesia. Maju terus Mongabay.
Saya Eni Rawan Putra, Direktur Eksekutif Rekam Nusantara Foundation, mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun Mongabay Indonesia yang ke-10. Semoga Mongabay Indonesia terus dapat membuat berita-berita yang mendalam tentang isu-isu lingkungan, konservasi, kehutanan, dan masyarakat adat di Indonesia. Selalu mendidik dan mengedukasi generasi muda Indonesia.
Halo, saya Salman Farisi. Saya adalah salah satu member dari Mongabay Indonesia Community MIC dan salah satu co-founder dari organisasi pemuda yang berfokus pada isu krisis iklim. Aku juga terdampak. Di sini saya ingin mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 bagi Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga selalu menjadi media lingkungan dan konservasi yang bergerak maju, dicintai oleh masyarakat Indonesia melalui berita-berita yang reliable, relevan, dan mencerahkan. Thank you.
Saya Bustar Maitar, CEO Yayasan Ekonusa. Kami fokus untuk bagaimana bersama masyarakat menyelamatkan hutan di Indonesia Timur dan memerangi perubahan iklim, memperjuangkan hak-hak masyarakat adat. Selamat dan sukses untuk 10 tahun Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga terus menginspirasi, menyebarluaskan kabar kebaikan dan kabar gerakan bersama masyarakat untuk iklim dan bumi kita di Indonesia.
Halo Sobat Mongabay Indonesia, perkenalkan saya Dwi Suprapti, saya penggiat konservasi satwa laut. Saya juga seorang dokter hewan yang tergabung dalam Asosiasi Dokter Hewan Megafauna Akuatik Indonesia atau biasa disebut dengan Iron Flying Fair. Keseharian saya bekerja di WWF Indonesia sebagai spesialis untuk konservasi penyu dan mamalia laut. Saya juga tentunya adalah pembaca setia dari Mongabay Indonesia. Pada kesempatan ini, saya ingin mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun yang ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga Mongabay semakin terdepan dan terlengkap dalam menyajikan berita-berita lingkungan, khususnya konservasi satwa laut. Selamat ulang tahun Mongabay Indonesia.
Saya Dedi Esa, Koordinator Program Forum Konservasi Loser dari London, Inggris. Saya mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun ke-10 untuk Mongabay Indonesia. Tetap semangat mendukung konservasi satwa liar dan alam Indonesia. Terima kasih.
Ilham Lestari, saya Iwan Dento dari Ramang-Ramang mengucapkan selamat hari jadi untuk Mongabay Indonesia yang ke-10. Tetap memberikan informasi yang memberikan ruang-ruang advokasi dan keberpihakan kepada lingkungan. Tetap bersama kami para penggerak dan para praktisi di berbagai kegiatan dan aktivitas. Tetap semangat, sekali lagi selamat berhari jadi untuk Mongabay. Saya Iwan Dento, salam adil dan lestari.
Halo, saya Sera dari Progress, Prakarsa Konservasi Ekologi Regional Sulawesi, ingin mengucapkan selamat ulang tahun kepada Mongabay Indonesia. Harapannya Mongabay Indonesia menjadi garda terdepan dan juga media terdepan dalam meningkatkan kesadaran mengenai isu-isu lingkungan hidup dan juga membangun public konstituen yang bisa pro lingkungan dan juga isu konservasi. Terima kasih.
Kami dari Yayasan Madani Berkelanjutan mengucapkan selamat hari jadi ke-10 Mongabay Indonesia. Semoga tetap menjadi media terdepan dalam memberitakan isu lingkungan hidup di Indonesia. Yeay!
Wah, luar biasa sekali ya sahabat Mongabay. Mari kita tepuk tangan untuk kita semua. Luar biasa sekali karena hari ini Bincang Alam kali ini berlangsung dengan sangat istimewa ya. Tadi kita sudah saksikan bagaimana ucapan-ucapan, doa dan harapan dari berbagai pihak, rekan, mitra, mulai dari Menteri Kelautan dan Perikanan Republik Indonesia, lalu juga ada ucapan-ucapan dari rekan-rekan akademisi, rekan-rekan influencer, rekan-rekan NGO dan juga aktivis-aktivis lingkungan. Pastinya itu sangat menjadi menjadi pacuan dan juga tambahan semangat bagi tim Mongabay Indonesia. Tadi juga sahabat Mongabay semua sudah menyaksikan diskusi saya bersama Rhett A Butler atau Rhett Butler. Bagaimana kita bertanya tentang bagaimana sih Rhett Butler ini mendirikan Mongabay dan apa ya pandangan-pandangan beliau atas isu-isu biodiversitas atau keanekaragaman hayati, karena pada tanggal 22 Mei tadi saya sudah sebut bahwa merupakan hari keanekaragaman hayati sedunia. Oleh karena itu, sebelum saya tutup, seperti biasa, saya ingin mengucapkan juga terima kasih banyak kepada rekan-rekan yang sudah mengirimkan pertanyaan-pertanyaannya untuk Rhett Butler. Nanti kita akan hubungi ya, bagi teman-teman yang sudah terpilih pertanyaannya, nanti kita akan hubungi oleh satu-satu gitu. Nah, dan juga seperti biasa saya ingin ingatkan ke sahabat Mongabay Indonesia untuk follow Instagram @mongabay.id, follow Twitter @mongabay.id, like Facebook page Mongabay Indonesia, subscribe YouTube Mongabay Indonesia, dan juga silahkan follow TikTok Mongabay Indonesia. Karena Bincang Alam juga nanti akan live juga di TikTok ya sahabat Mongabay. Dan juga jangan lupa kunjungi www.mongabay.co.id untuk berita lingkungan yang dipublikasikan setiap harinya. Oke, tanpa berlama-lama sahabat Mongabay, terima kasih banyak. Demikian Bincang Alam kita hari ini yang mengundang Rhett Butler. Saya mewakili tim Mongabay Indonesia mengucapkan terima kasih banyak dan apresiasi sebesar-besarnya untuk seluruh pembaca setia Mongabay dan juga untuk sahabat Mongabay yang selalu mendukung dan menemani perjalanan Mongabay Indonesia di 1 dekade terakhir ya, dan juga semua dukungan untuk Mongabay Indonesia di tahun-tahun ke depan agar Mongabay terus dapat berkomitmen dalam memberitakan isu-isu lingkungan yang aktual dan juga berimbang. Oke, terima kasih banyak sahabat Mongabay semua. Saya Akita Verselita pamit dulu, undur diri. Semoga sahabat Mongabay sehat semua. Sekali lagi, selamat malam. Salam lestari. Terima kasih banyak. Sampai bertemu di Bincang Alam minggu depan.